Welcome.
Добро пожаловать на сессии, на которой мы будем обсуждать очень важные вопросы.
Очень рада приветствовать вас на сессии, где мы планируем обсудить очень важный влияние в Казахстане. Наша сессия будет двуязычная. Поэтому, пожалуйста, если вам необходимо использовать наушники, то лучше сразу их приготовить. Меня зовут Адалят Абдуманапова. Я являюсь координатором проекта по корпоративному управлению в Казахстане. Я бы также хотела представить своего коллегу, который любезно согласился помочь мне модерировать эту очень важную сессию, Стив Стокс. Стив является партнером компании PricewaterhouseCoopers. Стив, thank you very much. Уважаемые коллеги, тема корпоративного управления очень давно обсуждается в Республике Казахстан. Было сделано очень много важных, очень много актуальных проектов. Но сейчас, во время глобализации, во время, когда перед нашей страной, перед нашими компаниями стоят вызовы как на глобальном, так и локальном уровне, то вопрос необходимости обеспечить функционирование компаний на должном уровне, с тем, чтобы они функционировали эффективно и устойчиво, становится еще более и более критичным. Поэтому сегодня мы планируем обсудить те вопросы, которые как раз-таки затрагивают то, как необходимо компаниям функционировать более эффективно. Международные финансовые корпорации входят в группу Всемирного банка. И сегодня мы являемся основными организаторами данной сессии. Поэтому, уважаемые коллеги, позвольте представить Томаша Тельма. Томаш является директором Международной финансовой корпорации в регионе Европа и Центральная Азия, а также Муаззама Микана, который является региональным менеджером в Центральной Азии Международной финансовой корпорации. И начать нашу сессию мне бы хотелось именно с Томаша и Муаззама, которые ее откроют. The floor is yours.
Panel participants, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming this morning. First, I should thank the organizers for allowing us the time to focus on corporate governance, which is a very important topic, and quite traditionally at the Astana Economic Forum, we are discussing corporate governance matters. As you already heard from Adele, we are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Our focus is private sector development in emerging markets in developing countries. And we do this through mobilizing private capital, through making investments, providing advisory services. Many of us, I think, are familiar with IFC's work in the emerging markets. Now, why we talk about corporate governance, we all know that it's very essential for private sector development. In very practical terms, it helps attract investments, it reduces the cost of capital, it improves overall company performance, and as we often have seen also in this region, it helps companies manage the impact of financial crises. We often wrongly think that corporate governance is something that's reserved for public companies, for listed companies and large corporations. We have some large corporations in the room today, so they can tell you about that. But we also know that, and again, from our experience in working in 100 countries around the world, this is not a matter which is reserved for large corporations. This is something that also applies to small businesses, applies to family-owned businesses, the profile of businesses which is quite common in this region and including in Kazakhstan. And we generally think that regardless of the size of the company, we definitely see that good corporate governance is the factor which attracts capital, lowers transaction cost, and builds or helps build investors' trust. IFC has worked on issues related to corporate governance for 20 years, so we're not new to this topic. Over the years, by our own count, we helped to facilitate somewhere in the order of $5.5 billion worth of investment in companies in emerging markets that have chosen themselves to work with IFC on corporate governance improvements and relied on our guidance, advice, support, and sometimes investments to actually make things happen. And it's not just IFC. There are a lot of international financial institutions, international development institutions, which together with IFC focus on that matter. There's a group of 35 development finance institutions which, under IFC's leadership, now have adopted a common framework on how to do the due diligence on corporate governance, what kind of standards to apply, and what to expect from companies in a corporate governance area. Those companies together represent somewhere in the order of $1 trillion, so $900 billion worth of assets of companies which are in the development finance sphere are working together along the same framework on corporate governance. So I'm not going to keep us too long from our discussion today. So I'm just going to maybe make one or two kind of final points, which I think are particularly relevant as we think on a subject that's not new to all of us, but it's something that's in our minds a moving target. So however good you think you are in applying corporate governance principles, you're never as good as you actually could be. And the best practice is a moving target. So the subjects which are the most relevant, whether it's for large companies or small companies, is really the improvements in disclosure and transparency, and in particular as relates to matters related to beneficial ownership and related party transactions. And the other part, which is for us at IFC becoming quite relevant, corporate governance is beginning to kind of broaden into areas related to environmental and social standards, and how the companies are looking at a whole compendium, the whole broad area of social responsibility and those broad standards. So I hope that today's discussion would enlighten us about what's going on in the field, first of all, but even more importantly, as we are really having this session in the midst of a very important event in Kazakhstan, to really think about how those standards can be put even under more attention in Kazakhstan itself, and then maybe how the companies in this country can get better at this, just as much as other places around the world are trying to do. So I'm going to turn over to Muazzam to bring it us closer to Kazakhstan.
So I would like to add my welcome to all of you to be present at this event. I think it is, for IFC, certainly it is an important event, and we value corporate governance quite a bit. I hope it is for you as well, and it is. I see that with so many people present here. I think this is a topic which we've been working on for Kazakhstan, which is the country, one of the countries I represent here. This is a topic which has probably become more important today than ever before, as the country moves towards greater role of the private sector in the economy. Privatization program actually is happening around in this particular country, and you have heard the President Nazarbayev talking about it, that it wants to increase the size of the private sector to the OECD level, which is about 15% of the economy. So the subject matter becomes extremely important when you're trying to attract the investors to the country who value disclosure, who value openness. They can rely on the accounting standards. These things matter quite a bit to bring the investors in this particular country. So over the 16 years or 17 years we've been focusing on corporate governance in Kazakhstan. I think we have done many things. We actually have worked with smaller companies, family-sized companies, worked with them on succession planning. How do you go to the next step? How do you become from a small company to a medium company, and then to probably a larger company? So a lot of that work has also been done. We've also been doing a lot of advocacy on this thing. We've been working with Samruk Kazina. We are partnering with their university to see how we can bring the standards on corporate governance universally accepted in Kazakhstan. We had an event, some of you probably attended last year, together with Samruk Kazina. 200 and so many people attended that event. I think that shows the strength of the importance of the topic. So I think this is something which we will continue to develop, but we need partners. I know we have lots of partners today from Atameka and others and Kakye. We want to make sure that when the government actually puts the IPO, whether on Kakye or it's going to be on the Astana International Financial Center, we get the investors in it. People begin to except the disclosure numbers which come with the firms which are listed there. So I think those are our focus going forward on this thing. I was talking actually to some of the private sector here, and they said, well, you've been doing it for so many years, this thing, but now there is a general acceptance of corporate governance in Kazakhstan now. I think people understand the importance of it. We need to now become more innovative. What to do next? I think we need to learn more about innovations which are happening around the world on corporate governance and where to lead us. So I think this is going to be the new future for us, an area which we're going to continue to focus on. So I don't want to take too much of your time here. We want to go into the discussion. One appeal I would have it, because I think we'll all learn through our discussion, so have a good discussion about it. I would invite some of the people who are sitting at the back to come to the table. There's some spaces here. So let's have a good discussion about it. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Steve Stocks. I'm actually a partner in over the last 6 to 8 months. I've actually spent a fairly significant amount of my time in Kazakhstan. I've really enjoyed that, first of all. Part of my role is actually to help Samruk Kazina with the privatization program and also the transformation program that underpins that. I think that one of the things that I've realized during that period is just how important corporate governance is to that overall program, and actually to the country as a whole in terms of what it's trying to achieve and the way in which it tries to attract international investment. So I think that today is incredibly important. That was reinforced yesterday in the keynote speech from Samruk Kazina with Mr. Shukayev. It was incredible. I noted how many times corporate governance was referred to during that presentation. So I think that this is probably the most important session in today's agenda. You're lucky to be here, so welcome everybody. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time because we've got an array of people around the table. Fortunately, we've got both international and local representation to talk about this subject. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to explain who's here, what we'll be talking about, and then actually let them do the talking. So first of all, we've got Erik Vermeulen, our Netherlands contact, both brilliant. And Eric's got a very interesting presentation about the pace of change in which we're currently operating, technology change, and the impact that that is going to have upon organisations and the way in which they have to manage their governance. We're then going to pass over to my UK, and he's going to talk about the importance of corporate governance both at a country level and an organisational level in giving investors confidence. We've then got Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, who's going to talk about actually how the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, and I now know that I see the word case and now understand what that actually represents, so thank you for that. But just exactly how the Stock Exchange is supporting and developing corporate governance in the country. Kukok Peng to talk about the lessons learned from the Malaysian experience of doing exactly what Kazakhstan is trying to achieve in terms of attracting international investment. And finally, Rustam Zersanov is going to, as a representative of Atamakin, is that right? Who I now know of entrepreneurs in the country, and talk about how that community is developing corporate governance. So, an incredibly diverse set of speakers. I think it'll show both international and local progress in this area. We've got two things to say before I pass over. Number one, this is the bad cop in this session. Adele is going to basically ensure that we keep to time, and I think that that's going to be a challenge given just how much we want to cover. But we also want this session to be interactive. We want you to get the most from it. So as we go through, if you do have questions, please ask them as we go. Adele will keep us to time as best she can, but I think we want it to be interactive. This is not a lecture, this is an interactive session. So with that, I'll say thank you and pass over to Eric. This is the guy who's going to talk about
works. So it's great being back in Kazakhstan. I was here last year. It was mentioned, the conference last year with more than 200 people. I was here last year. I was impressed. I loved it so much. But it was like March and it was very cold. And I'm so happy that they invite me back now in June, which is much warmer and nicer. So I'm going to talk while they have fixed my mic. Thank you so much. Whoa. So I'm going to talk about basically what's next. It was mentioned by one of the speakers that when you talk about corporate governance, most people say, well, we know about it. And we want to know what's next. And as you can see on the slide, I'm going to talk about the 21st century perspective on corporate governance. And basically the new dialogue with investors. We start for like big listed companies, but at the end, basically everything I said goes for the smallest to the biggest companies in the world. So it's something that everybody should remember. But it's a new thing, because if you want to know about corporate governance, the traditional way, well, you just go to Amazon and that's what you see. There are plenty of books about corporate governance, and they basically all say the same thing. And you can also look at corporate governance in Asia, corporate governance in the United States, in South America. You just go there and you find the traditional way. Now, to give you, for the people that say, well, I don't know the traditional way, let me give you a kind of 101 on traditional corporate governance. Well, it started basically here when you have a scandal. Like in the beginning of 2000s, we had like a huge scandal in the United States, but also in other countries in the world, where managers were basically acting like opportunistically. They were misbehaving, and we don't want that. So we thought, well, we need some rules, we need some guidance to avoid, to prevent misbehavior. And to make sure that everybody within the company is actually working in the interest of the shareholder. So when you look at the slide, you see that control and responsibility flows down from the shareholders to the board of directors, then the CEO and all the other executives and then staff. But they're all responsible eventually to the shareholders, and then you create some checks and balances and you prevent basically crises and scandals. And we came up with fantastic rules that are really necessary and important. So we had internal control and audit rules. We had board independence, because otherwise how can you have checks and balances when all these people are basically friends and they know each other? So we need independence. We need transparency and disclosure. That was mentioned as one of the key things. If we don't know anything about the company, how can we be responsible? How can you be held accountable? So transparency and disclosure is very important. The rights of shareholders, how can they actually, enforce their rights, use their rights to hold other people accountable. And then we got corporate governance codes, which are comply and explain, which gave us kind of flexibility to say, well, one size does not fit all, so let's give companies a way out. But then they have to explain deviation, which was fantastic. And we all thought, well, if all the companies follow this, we will not have issues anymore. But this was like early 2000s and these rules were developed, but then we had the financial crisis in 2008. And then all of a sudden, many regulators and academics said, oh my God, we had all these rules, but still we have problems. Well, one of the problems, there were many, but one of the problems was that we did not really know who the shareholders were. Who are these investors? Right? And then we figured out that the investors are actually pretty difficult to figure out who they are. It's a very difficult, as you can see on this slide, investment chain. A chain of investors where you have owners and you have the managers, the asset managers. And there might be, when you just look at shareholders as one group, within that group there are a lot of conflicts of interest. And a lot of people were just being incentivized by looking at the money. So money first. And that could create issues. So people thought, or many people, when you talk to specialists, they say, well, the investors might have been the problem of the financial crisis. But you can also look at it the other way. we can make the investors the solution of all the problems. And that's what we see in the world right now. So I talked about the past, and now we are what is happening today. So today, many people, corporate governance specialists, think that institutions, particularly institutional investors, are the solution to the problems that we have, but then we have to give them guidance. We have to give them guidance to help companies. They have to become more engaged. And in order to get them more engaged, the UK came up with a stewardship code. So they see the investors as stewards, and basically they also have a responsibility to work together with managers and the board of directors to have a sustainable company and to work on growth and to make sure that everything works really well. So here you see stewardship is more than just voting, is engagement as a purposeful dialogue between the investor and the people within the company. And this was just in the UK in 2010, they revised it in 2012, and now it's really taking off. If you look at this slide, we see initiatives, similar initiatives in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, South Africa, Switzerland, Japan, Malaysia, Italy, Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, United States, Brazil, and Korea. Some of them private initiatives, other public initiatives where the government is involved, but it's happening. And everybody now thinks this is a great way to attract foreign investors. And we see this also in Kazakhstan. That was really interesting, that in March 2017, the Astana International Financial Center, together with City UK, came out with a report about the stewardship code. And basically, this is about making investors better investors. Investors that are actually engaged with companies. And this could help increase the performance of Samruk Kaizana. Other institutional investors could be attracted by this. Foreign investors would see that Kazakhstan is a very serious place, so they are willing to invest in Kazakhstan. You will see an open dialogue, and this might help the privatization, as was mentioned before. Because if you are privatizing and you do this by bringing companies to a stock exchange, and we will talk about stock exchanges today as well, then obviously you want to attract investors. And we have this kind of code, everybody will benefit. Particularly the board of directors will also be better because they realize that they will have investors that are actively engaged, which will improve the performance of the board of directors. So basically you get better checks and balances. So that's where we are now. All of a sudden we are looking at investor engagement and dialogue. Question then is this enough? Because one problem that we might have is when you have all these mechanisms, that the only thing we talk about within companies is corporate governance. Basically having checks and balances. And we might forget about the long-term strategy, the innovation and value creation within companies. And this is a complaint that you hear a lot in practice. When you talk about with directors, say, well, we talk about corporate governance only, but it's growth. And what's next? The innovation. How can we innovate? How can we remain competitive? So this brings us to the theme of this whole event, which is new energy, new economy. And this is where most companies struggle. Because we have now an economy where sensors, smart cities, big data and connectivity are so important that you as a company cannot operate alone anymore. You need help from startups, other companies, and companies become more networks. And the question then is, what's the role of corporate governance in this new world? Well, the thing is the following, and I'm almost at the end of my presentation, so it's pretty good. So here we see basically the exponential growth of innovation, and we are here, like 2017. And as you can see, in a kind of 3, 4, 5 years, we see so much innovation, and the world will change so fast that we will be better connected, artificial intelligence will take off, we see already robots emerging, automation, what will happen with jobs, all these things matter to all the companies in the world. And the question is, how can corporate governance help? Well, one interesting thing is that modern investors, and this is particularly important given the theme of this conference, that modern investors seem to value big data, algorithms and software code more than physical assets and commodities like oil. And this is just to show you what the biggest companies in the world, what the valuations were. Like in 2001, we still had banks and oil companies there. But in 2016, it's Apple, it's Google, it's Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. These are the biggest companies in the world according to their market capitalization, and they don't have oil and banks. These are like software-driven, algorithm-driven companies that know how to use big data. And in order to give you one case study, just to think about how corporate governance should take like the innovation into account and how it should help the dialogue between investors and the company, is Tesla. Here you see how investors struggle with understanding a company. Tesla is, according to some, a car company. But it's also a software and big data company. It's all about innovation. And when you just look at what the market is doing, we see the following. We see that the stock price is really soaring, so investors really believe that Tesla is going to be a big company. But the loss is titanic. It's like enormous. They burn money like crazy. And now the market capitalization, so the value on the stock exchange of Tesla, is almost the same value as GM and already higher than Ford. But if you look at the sales, they only sell like 76,000 cars, whereas GM had like in 2016 sales of more than 3 million. So why do investors love Tesla so much? That's the big question. And what has corporate governance to do with this? Well, corporate governance of the future, and that's the discussion that we should have, is basically about creating a culture aimed at innovation and long-term value creation. As I mentioned, Tesla is a data-driven company. With these cars, they have 1.3 billion miles of data that they can share with governments, and they do that in order to get like traffic flows better. But it's all about an inclusive culture. And this brings me to the next slide. So, what's next? There was a question that was asked. Well, corporate governance should be more about having a dialogue. Dialogue between all the stakeholders, like the board of directors, managers, but also the investors. And having a purposeful dialogue in an informal setting, where you have social media. You use social media to get more information about companies. It's about mission-oriented. It's about storytelling. It's about the best idea wins culture. And when you have this kind of like company where managers and investors interact in an informal way and a personalized way, then they can help each other prepare for the future. Thank you very much.
Present before, I knew I was going to struggle to follow him, and even more so when I saw the slides with the robots last night. So I did consider presenting mine in the form of mime and modern dance in the hope that this might make it more interesting, but Adele made it very clear that I would be sort of pulled off stage. So I'm going to do this in the old-fashioned traditional way of just talking, I'm afraid. I just want to speak briefly about owners that Eric referred to, including large public pension and sovereign wealth funds. And some of these investors have billions and in some cases trillions of dollars of assets to invest, and partly because of the size of the amounts of money they need to invest, and partly in order to spread the risk, increasingly their equity investment strategies are becoming global. So this presents a great potential for Kazakh companies to attract international investment, but obviously there's also a lot of competition for that investment as well. And as has already been said, there are really, I think, two stages of the assessment that investors will make when considering where to place their money. The first is the country one in which we feel willing to invest, and the second is what about the individual companies. And in terms of the country, I think many of the points I was going to make have already been made by Moazam and Thomas, so I won't repeat them. Of course, investors will look at the general operating environment, the investment environment. Is the political stability, is the economy in a good state, how well developed is the market and the corporate sector. But they will also look at the regulation of companies and the regulations relevant to corporate governance and things like related party transactions has been mentioned. Last year, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, produced a series of reports assessing the state of the legal framework and for corporate governance in different countries, including one on Kazakhstan. And the EBRD report was fairly positive about many aspects of the regulatory framework here. It talked about the rules of shareholder rights, including the protection of minority shareholders, being fairly strong. Financial reporting and auditing were also considered to be fairly strong. The areas that the EBRD highlighted as needing more work were non-financial reporting, which I think goes to the point that Eric was making about transparency and understanding all aspects of the business and the business performance, not just the financials. It also felt that the current corporate governance code, which I believe dates back to 2005 or 2007, was rather out of date now and could do with being looked at again and updated, and that there were some gaps and inconsistencies in the law. So from what that assessment says, and I'm probably the least qualified person in the room to say whether that's a fair assessment, but if that is a fair assessment, then it sounds like there's a lot of strong foundations here, but there is still more work to do. The only thing I would add to that, which is something from my experience as a former regulator, is often you find that the law that looks good on paper is not always so good in practice, and this is something we found even in the UK recently, where a number of the directors who have been behaving badly and doing things that are against the spirit of their duties and legal responsibilities, it has actually proved very difficult to produce any prosecution. So the test is not just does it work on paper, but does it work on practice, and that's also often much more difficult from the outside to determine. In terms of the companies, again, this is something that a lot of the points that I was going to say have been covered already by Eric, but I think the important one that he mentioned, which is one of the unfortunate side effects of the focus on governance, and this is certainly something that we saw with the UK Stewardship Code, which Eric highlighted in his slides, is that while it's excellent that there is more discussion around governance and more dialogue around governance, it's unfortunate if that's at the expense of dialogue and discussion around other aspects like the company's strategy and the sustainability of the business model. And I think both sides, certainly in my experience in the UK, find this rather frustrating, because companies tell us they would rather talk about those aspects in governance, but investors say the same thing. So you would hope that it's not beyond their combined ability to put that right, because that is ultimately the thing will be a determining factor on whether they invest in a company. Is there a strategy? Is there a track record and performance? The governance is an important factor in weighing up the risk-reward. If there's a low potential for a return and a high risk because of the way the company is governed, then that tilts the balance, but it is only part of the consideration. That said, it's a very important one, and there was a survey carried out by McKinsey a number of years ago, talking to institutional investors and saying, when investing in what they call developing markets, how important is corporate governance as opposed to financial performance? And the response was that 80% of them said it was either as important or more important than the financial performance. So it's a big factor. The different issues that investors will look at in terms of the board and risk management, again, Eric covered these in the slides, so I won't repeat them. One thing I would say, if you want an easy guide to the sort of issues that you can expect international institutional investors to raise, there's an organisation called the Institute of Corporate Governance, I've forgotten their name, ICGN, I should know, I work for them, this is rather embarrassing. Anyway, I have a few copies of their principles here, and they're enigmatic but excellent. Finally, I just want to say a few things about privatisation. And this, obviously, as everyone others have said, this is a big issue here at the moment in Kazakhstan. And I think it's very important that the preparation for that takes account of the governance issues that will be so important to investors if you wish to attract them. And like others, I thought it was very encouraging in the presentation yesterday that Mr. Shukayev and his colleagues gave the number of times they referred to transparency, openness, and the importance of corporate governance. Just quickly, a few of the specific issues that investors will be interested in when considering investing in a part privatised or soon to be privatised company, in addition to all the normal questions they ask. The first is, will the state be retaining a stake in the company, in particular a controlling stake? This isn't necessarily a deterrent at all, but what they will look for assurance is there will be some form of formal agreement which sets out the limits of the state's involvement, ideally something that restricts its ability to interfere in the day-to-day operational management of the company. Similarly, they'll be looking to see what the voting rights are for the shareholders, including the state. Are the limits on what matters minority shareholders are able to vote on? What weight does their vote have in comparison with others? In some countries, you see cases where partly privatised state-owned enterprises give the state what's called a golden share, which is a share that enables them essentially to veto any other votes. And this is something that is a deterrent to institutional investors, because essentially it means it doesn't matter what your rights are on paper. If you can be vetoed, they're essentially meaningless. So that's something to bear in mind in designing the ownership structure post-privatisation. There is then the question of the board and management, both their independence and their competence. And I think at the very least, investors will be looking for a transparent process of appointment. What you tend to hear is that if you have a board made up of politicians, regulators or civil servants, firstly, they are suspicious about whether that is a truly independent board, whatever the formal arrangements may be. And secondly, they would have concerns if none or few of those individuals have any previous experience of running an organisation, a private company, because they would question whether they have the capacity and ability to do that job. Now, as a former civil servant myself, obviously I think that's an outrageous slur, but that is what investors tell us. So it's the question about the composition and competence and independence of the board. There's the question about whether the company will continue to have what you might call public policy or social policy objectives. In many cases, this is the case, and quite rightly. So, for example, you will often see utility companies with a requirement to have a universal service. Again, this isn't necessarily something that investors would be concerned about as long as they were aware of it and knew what they were buying into, which I think is the main message. And finally, we also get told regularly is that in terms of governance arrangements, if the company is going to be going for an IPO, the expectation would be that its governance arrangements are consistent with those that are considered standard for all other listed companies. If they want to take advantage of being listed and the opportunities that provides for raising capital, they should play by the rules of the game. And I think that's probably a good point to stop and move on to the stock exchange to give their take on what's up.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think we've got very excited from Eric's presentations, from Robert and Big Data and Tesla. But Chris, your presentation gave us a That was so exciting too, because we've got the concrete list of questions to do our homework before, right, target the particular investor. So thank you so much. And now we are going to land in Kazakhstan, and I would like to invite Alina Oldenbergen, the chairman of Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, to tell about the role that Какие, and the role is very important, plays in the development of corporate governance. Thank
Everybody, thank you for inviting me to such a corporate governance forum. I think it's very important in Kazakhstan. During Astana Economic Forum today and yesterday, we have discussed a number of issues, and all of them are addressed at how the economy is changing. And the corporate governance is a question about how the companies should be changing. And I think this is the issue that we all need to pay more attention, because in Kazakhstan, in general, the corporate governance standards here, we have them. The question is how many companies apply them. For example, in the state sector, when we have state-owned enterprises, there are certain corporate governance codes which are developed for them, especially Samruk Kazana, Bayterek Holding. But what we observe that also, depending on which ministry is managing which state organization, there are different corporate governance standards, and that's what also needs to be worked on. We also have corporate governance standards set by the regulator, National Bank of Kazakhstan. It's applied to financial organizations, and it's also a certain standard. But then, because there needs to be a greater transparency, greater responsibility towards stakeholders, clients and depositors. But when we are talking about the private sector, this is a matter of whether the company is a joint stock company or limited partnership, and only joint stock companies basically apply the requirements that are set by the law on joint stock companies. And therefore, the role of organizations such as IFC, ourselves, National Chamber of Entrepreneurs, Atomican is very important. That's why last year Stock Exchange signed a memorandum of understanding with National Chamber of Entrepreneurs, and one of the points specifically was not only getting access to financial markets, capital markets in particular, but also developing and setting corporate governance, educating entrepreneurs on how to apply corporate governance standards. And that's where we are right now paying more attention. But to come back basically to what we have right now, I have to mention that the stock exchange is operating in Kazakhstan already for 24 years. This year will be 24th anniversary, next year the 25th anniversary since establishment of Kazakhstan or as an independent country. We are right now a universal exchange. We trade different instruments. And among our companies listed on stock exchange, we have more than 140 issuers, 120 stocks in listing, and 260 corporate bonds. We hold by volumes the second largest place among CIS stock exchanges and the fifth by market capitalization of stocks among FIAS. This is the Federation of Eurasian Exchanges, which includes Eastern Europe, CIS, and Middle East. We are qualified as frontier market, and we are planning to obtain this status by FTSE in September. Frontier markets is a step before becoming an emerging market, and it depends on the level of development of the stock market and the liquidity in the stock market. In terms of one of our strategy, I want to mention briefly that the development strategy includes that we need to further develop our financial instruments, the markets, foreign exchange market in particular, clearing services. We need to focus on our customer improvement, working with our clients, its membership firms, investors or issuers, and increase efficiency of stock exchange business. We have significant market volumes during the past 2 years. Last year, the total trading volume was around 276 billion. This year, already for 5 months, we have $220 billion. This depends because we have not only stocks, cash equity, cash bonds market, but also significant repo, swap, and currency trading on the stock exchange. Our listed companies represent by industry the same composition as our economy basically demonstrates, and also reflects the corporate governance. Those companies which are ready to disclose information, to become public and raise financing publicly. That's why you see that in shares market we have 69.8% represented by energy sector, 12.8% by finance, and then telecommunications. While in bonds market, it's mostly also finance, it's 47% raised by financial institutions and energy companies. So again, in our listing structure, we have about 90%, and that composition has actually changed after the crisis in 2008. 90% are either financial institutions or national companies. When, for example, in 2008 to 2010, we had more private companies in the market. Therefore, for us, it's very important to show and demonstrate that the stock exchange can actually provide financing for capital markets. And in general, to increase competitiveness of our domestic companies, it's very important they also diversify sources of financing, not only banks, but also raising equity and bonds. Here you can see that the market capitalization of stock market is right now $46 billion. But the trading is still shallow because a lot of companies have dual listings. Some of them are listed in London, one of the biggest ones. And it also depends on the liquidity in the market. What is the level of participation of institutional investors and the individuals? And as you know, when pension funds were united, liquidity has significantly dropped, and that's what you see during the last 3-4 years. But the interest of the market is coming back, and that's what we see in 2016-17, that more companies want to raise financing by issuing equity. With corporate bonds market, we have also decreased nominal issue of bonds. It's right now $24 billion. Primarily it's issued by financial institutions or national companies, as I mentioned before. And you can see that there is some reduction in terms of number of issues, but we see that this trend is changing this year because 10-year funds become more available. It's cheaper right now, and a very good yield that you can basically raise in the capital markets. During May, we had already 5 issues by such institutions like Eurasian Bank of Development. They issued 15 billion tenge for 3 years. The Development Bank of Kazakhstan raised 50 billion in tenge. Some banks raised, like Home Bank, raised 10 billion in tenge, 3, 5, 7-year term, and the maximum yield is up to 15%. Our index right now includes 8 stocks. Again, this is the best of the sector. It's basically Kazmunay gas exploration development, Kazminerals, which is one of the best performer in the index. Some banks like Halyk Savings Bank and Central Credit Bank, and also the companies which went to public IPO like Kastransol and Kigok, and telecommunication, Kazakh Telecom, Kcell. Какие index performance was very good last year. We actually hold the 3rd place after Peru and Brasilia, as you can see by index, because we have the same structure of the economy. They were also affected by devaluation, and in 2016 was rebounding basically after devaluation when the assets in tenge revalued, and that's why the index grew by 58%. This year, for 5 months, we have already 15% growth. We have changed the listing structure. Again, cooperating with the National Chamber of Commerce, we were talking about making capital markets more accessible to SME sector. That's why we have changed the listing structure to show that the top market is basically for large corporates, for high liquidity or IPO issuers. For alternative trading platform, we have requirements for SME. We reduced disclosure requirements, made them less strict. The barrier to basically enter the market is lower, and also changed the tariff structure. When we are talking about the corporate governance and stock exchange, it's very important that the stock exchange traditionally plays a significant role, because this is the market where you actually disclose and demonstrate your corporate governance. And among our listing requirements, we have effective corporate code. You have to have a corporate code. We require financial reporting in accordance with IFRS or American standards like GAAP. We require that there is a profound auditing company to which investors can trust. If initially, in the beginning, it was mostly international firms like top 5, like Pricewaterhouse, Ernst & Young, Deloitte. Right now, we have extended the list to local companies. There are already more than 15 auditing companies. Those who comply with standards, having professionals, and this basically is improving in Kazakhstan because the auditing companies, domestic ones, become more and more qualified. And we also require that, since it's a public trading, public offerta to investors, there are no basically restrictions on disposal of shares or bonds. Therefore, in stock exchange, we require transparency as a key factor of investment attractiveness. This is provided through information disclosure, financial reporting, requirement of an annual audit. And we are also introducing new non-financial activities reporting. Like, for example, for oil and gas companies, we require reporting in accordance with international standards of CRC. On mineral resources, basically, you have to provide that you have audited resources. We also introduced the methodology on environmental, social responsibility and corporate governance. We have issued it as a guide last year, but we are requiring that in the future we will make it a requirement for certain companies. Investment attractiveness of companies is basically composition of public monitoring. We have bondholders representatives bodies, we have rating agencies. The national rating agencies are just developing, mostly apply the international rating agencies, basically ratings. We have a market maker which supports the market and provides analytical coverage. Among our initiatives, we are closely cooperating with the IFC. We have introduced for our listed companies scoring cards based on IFC methodology, where they, on voluntary basis, basically can score the level of corporate governance standards, how they apply, and the way they can improve. We are requiring technical audit of innovational projects, expert valuation report. We are working on the working group together with Ministry on Finance on improving corporate reporting, and continue to work on the UN initiative for stock exchanges, for sustainable stock exchanges. This, as I mentioned, we introduced ECG reporting, and we also plan to introduce detail it more towards gender reporting and so on. As I mentioned, stock exchange plays an active role actually in educating companies, and even already this year we're planning to have a session together again with the IFC and with other consulting firms on corporate governance, on how to do it, basically what the fundamentals, what's the reason behind it. We also holding this month's investor relations conference, where we would like to show to listed companies and those who are willing to enter the market how to establish relationship with investors, how to maintain it, what kind of disclosure provide and support this. We also with listed companies, we are holding Investor Day at Какие. It becomes more important, especially for those who have a large number of shareholders who went through public IPOs. And we had two state-owned companies, Какие and Стран, having public IPOs, and two smaller companies, Bust and Какие metal construction company. And those companies actually annually hold meetings with investors at stock exchange.
Alina Optimism, I'm very sorry because we're so tight on timing.
Yeah.
Today
I'm
a
just
bad
completing
cop.
my presentation. I already noticed the sign. I just want to mention that again, we are setting the standards, we are educating, holding the seminars, but we have to mention that the number of companies still going public is very low. For example, if we take medium launching business, it's around 9,000, only 143 is on the list. Among joint stock companies out of 2,288 is only 1 or 2 on the list. So it's basically the way to develop further. And that also reflects on our ratings internationally. Thank you.
Alina, thank you. I think we can all see that there's been some tremendous progress locally. But as we said at the outset, there's always opportunity to learn. So I'm now going to pass over to Mr. Ku to talk about the experience in Malaysia and maybe how they are maybe a step further down the maturity model and understand a little bit more about that experience.
Less travel in two ways. It's the story of Malaysia as the road less travel. But also this morning in this panel, I'm taking the road less travel as well, because I'm probably the only one, apart from Chris, who touched on it a little bit, that will talk about public governance and the perspective that it can provide to companies. You can actually draw the parallel between public governance and private governance. Public governance, if done well, will spur investors to put in money into the economy. It will spur the consumers to consume, and it will also spur trade between country and within the country. And ultimately, it will translate into votes for the government of the day or not, depending on how they perform. So when you draw the parallel with corporate governance, then you see the same trends. Good corporate governance will promote investment, it promotes sales, it promotes collaboration with other companies in the ecosystem, and ultimately it will get the board re-elected when the shareholders actually come together to vote. So yes, so this is the road less travel. So the story I'm going to tell today is going to start with a little bit of macroeconomics and background in terms of where Malaysia, what Malaysia went through in terms of public governance, and then a little bit about that public governance itself and how it could relate to the corporate sector. Next page, please. It's not working. Yeah, over here. Okay, maybe I'll just get the person to toggle for me. Just move the page. Is that possible? Maybe we could get Eric to provide us with some Philips equipment, then it will work better. I realize
It's remote control.
okay, it's not working, so okay. It's with him. Can I just get the person to toggle it for me? I think that's okay. Sorry, you got to enjoy the scenery for a little bit more.
Is this when I can do my mime and modern dance?
Yeah, I was going to say, you maybe should switch to mime.
Next slide. Okay. Now, from a country perspective, Malaysia took a look at the countries around the world, and most countries take the road most traveled. In the high-income countries, 90% of them has wide income disparity and also an unsustainable fiscal position. Next. It's working. Okay, next slide. It's not working again. Yeah, just manage it from there. The road less traveled, I'm moving on to the next slide, are basically countries that have what we call, went on a mildly expansionary policy where they will grow, but they will not grow on steroids, and at the same time they keep to certain fiscal discipline. So in that way, it does not become unsustainable, and it is growth that can continue to go on for a long time. Is it working now? Can we move to the next slide? Okay, this is the road less travel. We'll move on. Next. Next, yeah. Okay, so in Malaysia, the Prime Minister Najib came into office in 2009, and he decided that we're going to go on a transformation program, and this is where the government made very public promises about what it would do to achieve citizen as well as economic outcomes. Next slide. Okay, all right. We promised, for example, that Malaysia, which is a country that was stuck in the middle income trap for about 20 to 30 years, will be in the high income bracket by the year 2020. And we have since closed the gap from 33% to 15% in 2015. Next slide. In terms of private investment between 2006 and 2010, the CAGR growth was a little bit sluggish, 5.5%, but with the transformation program, it has since grown by 11% between 2011 and 2016. Next. Also, in terms of fiscal deficit, I spoke about the importance to have fiscal discipline. We basically managed to move the fiscal deficit from 6.7% to 3.1% last year. And this is very important to allow us to sustain the growth. Next. We created 2.2 million jobs in the process. We promised to create 3.3 million, and this is all very publicly pronounced. Next. And in the process, we're putting infrastructure for both the citizens in the rural area, as you can see from here, in terms of roads, water, electrification, and housing. Next. But also in terms of uplifting low-income people, getting people out of poverty, creating employment opportunity or business opportunity so that they can improve on their income. Next. So those are the results, but how did we get there? So the key lesson that we have to share is in two folds. We have a 8-step, what we call big fuss result methodology. We don't believe in doing things in a slow burn manner and you get results in a slow manner as well. We believe in big fuss result. But also underlying that there are 3 transformational leadership qualities that we believe is important to support any transformation. Next. So this is the 8-step big fast result methodology. The way we've done it is almost akin to corporate governance in the sense that it has elements of transparency, it has element of engagement, it is inclusive by creating a platform where public and private can collaborate to develop the roadmap and the development of the economic or the citizen outcome programs are actually from the ground up. So step number 1 is about strategic direction. This is where the leadership is very important in terms of being ruthless in prioritizing what is it that you will do, and more importantly, what is it that you will not do. So in the economic sphere, in Malaysia's example, we decided to go on 12 focus sectors, not the 40 that we have across the current account or rather the national accounts if you look at them. Then the next step is to take the focus areas into what we call the labs. And this is where we bring the public and private sector together to create programs that will reach the outcome in terms of investment, jobs, and income generation. Now, for the economic transformation program in Malaysia, we basically put together 500 people from both the public and private sector. We lock them out in one location, and they are told that they cannot leave until they come up with solutions. So basically, it was Hotel California, for those of you who are familiar. You can check out, but you can't leave. So then with the program, we take it to the public. We have open days to let the public give us the feedback. We then publish the roadmap in step number 4, which is a very detailed a document. And we made our ministers pledge that they will deliver those outcomes. So we call this the process of making them pregnant. Because when you make them pregnant, there can only be one outcome, which is to deliver. Right? Now, that's not enough. What we also do is we set KPIs. So from 10 years KPIs, we have annual KPI, monthly KPI, weekly KPIs. This is tracked. And the minister's performance are tracked on a weekly basis. We also then couple that with the implementation governance. So we have people at the working level, at the technical level, the steering committee level, and ultimately at the Prime Minister's level through problem-solving meetings. Problem-solving meetings are very important because it basically is a process where you are given an opportunity with your authority to deliver on your outcomes, but if you fail, the Prime Minister would decide and take that authority away from you and just tell you, do it, I've made the decision. So nobody likes to go there, no civil servant likes to go there, and certainly no private companies that are involved in that venture would like to go there. We call that the Putrajaya Inquisition, not unlike the Spanish Inquisition, for those of you who are familiar. And finally, the last 2 steps involve is getting private third-party auditors to actually look at the outcomes and validate them, and then eventually publish them in an annual report. So you could see that this is a very, very transparent, very engaging process in public governance, and you can draw lessons from here for the corporate governance. Okay, next slide. The secrets, and I'll just share 3 very briefly in a short period of time. Next slide. We believe in the game of the impossible. When you set out on the journey, you must do something that is not merely incremental. It's got to be something that's very stretched. So for example, next slide. The Prime Minister asked us at the start of the economic transformation program, how do we kickstart this private investment interest again? How do you secure 300 billion in the 8-week lab that we had? But we did. With the 500 people, the results were, next slide, we actually drew in commitment of 406 billion through 131 what we call entry point projects, which is very similar to the Kazakh 100 concrete steps. Yeah, so that's the equivalent, which will give you the incremental GNI of about 250 billion USD in the year 2020, and then creating 3.3 million jobs in the process. Next. You got to be ruthless in terms of prioritization. I already mentioned this. You got to corral people so that they focus on the priorities, because you cannot do everything and do them very well. Next slide. So we prioritize in the economic sector, in the citizen outcome sector. We do labs so that we bring all the parties together to develop the programs. Budgets and resources must be allocated, because if you don't, nothing is going to move. In Malaysia, we have a saying, if you have a plan, but you don't have a budget behind the plan, it's basically a draft, because nothing gets done. And then we make people accountable to deliver on the KPIs and targets. Both the public and private sector are equally responsible depending on the program that they are embarking on. Next. And this is just to give you some colors. You know, we talk about 100 MNCs in KL. We have already brought in 64. Next. We've managed to complete the first line of our first mass rapid transit, 51 kilometers, 2 weeks ahead of time, and 2 billion ringgit below budget. Next. And then finally, the final secret, which is the discipline of action. So we believe in the next slide. This thing, I'll skip again. Next slide. We believe in DMS, in short. Do it relentlessly, monitor it constantly, and solve problem recursively. And this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of the governance, the different level of governance structure, ending up with the Prime Minister himself chairing the Putrajaya Inquisition or the problem-solving meeting. So this is a discipline of action that has got to be repeated. And I think the same applies in a corporate governance condition. Next slide. So this is my last slide. So Robert Frost said, two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So this is the real life story of Malaysia. We took the road less traveled. We did things differently. In many ways, we did public governance in a way that mirrors proper corporate governance, and we saw the result. And that has made all the difference for us. Thank you.